Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity. I am here to count down my top 15 least favorite episodes from my favorite shows. So in this video I will count down what I consider to be the worst episodes from shows that I consider to be the best shows. So first of all, one thing I want to make really clear, if there's an episode from a show that appears on this list, that means I love that show. In fact, if I didn't love that show, then it would not be eligible for this list. So, shows that I do not like, that I think are terrible, such as like Everybody Loves Raymond, Outlander, Friends, or basically every reality show in existence, they're not eligible because that's the low-hanging fruit for me. Also, even shows that I like, but I don't think are great, I don't think are the best, shows like Orphan Black, or The 100, or Dark Matter, or Brooklyn Nine-Nine, they're decent shows, I enjoy watching them, but they're not my favorite shows of all time. So they're not even eligible either. So I don't want to see any comments on this video saying, "Oh, why do you hate this show? The show's so good. What do you have against the show?" If a show appears on this list, that means I love it. That means I think that show's amazing. But great shows, even my favorite shows I consider to be some of the best shows in existence, still have terrible episodes, or episodes that I particularly hate. Just because I think a show is great doesn't mean every single episode in that show is great. Every once in a while there'll be some episodes that I think are really bad, especially comparatively speaking to how great the rest of the show is. So that's what this video is for. So I am counting down 15 episodes that I really don't like from shows that I really do like. Now, of course, with any type of video like this, top 15, top 10, whatever, this is all my opinion, obviously. People will have different opinions sometimes. Some of these shows people will think aren't that great, and some of these episodes people will think are really great and will completely disagree with me, their inclusion on this list. Now, I know there's several episodes that people love that will appear in this list, so I know it's going to rub people the wrong way. In fact, it's always tricky doing videos like this, these worst type videos, because you know that's more likely to upset people or get people that strongly disagree with you, which is why I've actually had this idea to do this video for like several years now, but I kept putting it off because it's no fun pissing people off or upsetting people. But I finally decided, you know what, I want to just put my opinion out there, put it out there. Maybe you agree, maybe you disagree, and if you disagree, that's fine. If you strongly disagree and you think I'm wrong and you want to tell me I'm wrong, please feel free to do so in the comment section below. That's fine as long as you do so in a civil manner. And another rule that I will have for this top 15 is that each show can only have one episode in this list. Otherwise it gets, I don't want to get bogged down too much with one show and another. So it's a limit for one episode per show. Anyway, let's now get into it. Let's get into my top 15 least favorite episodes from my favorite shows. And we'll start with my number 15, Unfinished Business from Battlestar Galactica. Now, this I have already gotten a lot of arguments and feedback and people telling me that they love this episode when I named this as the worst episode of Battlestar Galactica. But I stand by that this is a terrible episode and definitely the worst that Battlestar Galactica produces. This is the episode where it's a boxing episode. It's when they're boxing and they have these pointless flashbacks, this stupid soap opera type melodrama, and it's all centered around the boxing where they're all like, "Oh, that's it," and they're acting all like, it's out of character and it's boring, and it's more than boring, it's really silly and ridiculous to watch, and I just couldn't stand watching this episode. So That's one of my least favorite episodes. So then we'll get into my number 14, which is Soulmates from Babylon 5. Now, this episode, I didn't necessarily get people telling me they loved this episode, but some people said that they thought it was alright, and they don't understand why I think it's the worst of Babylon 5. But for me, this is nails on the chalkboard. Really grating. I would name this, maybe it's another list I'll do another day, but one of the most annoying episodes that I ever have to sit through, and I never want to have to sit through it again. This is a Babylon 5 episode that centers around Lando, a fan favorite character whom I actually really don't like. That's another disagreement I had with a lot of Babylon 5 fans, that I don't really like the Centauri in general. They come off as really silly and ridiculous, and not really like aliens. They're just like caricatures. And Lando in particular, it was really hard for me to get on board with. I mean, he had some interesting storylines in the show, I'll give you that. But for this episode, it was about 3 ex-wives coming aboard the station. They each like hounding him and being annoying in different ways. And oh my fucking God, I just could not stand it. Anyway. We get into my number 13, which is Fish Out of Water from BoJack Horseman. Now, if there's any entry on my list that's going to piss people off, this is probably the one most likely to do so, because many people would put this in the top 5 list of best episodes of BoJack Horseman. In fact, you go to any random best episode list of BoJack Horseman, you'll probably find this at least in the top 10, if not the top 5. And there are essays about how this episode's brilliant, but I'm sorry, I hated this episode with a strong passion. In fact, the first time I watched this show, I skipped this episode because I couldn't even stand to watch it. It was bothering me so much. But since everyone talked about how great it was, I went back and sat through it, watched the whole thing, gave it a chance, and my first impression of it was correct. It's terrible. Now, it's so out of character for BoJack. Now, I will grant you part of the reason why I hate this episode so much is my own personal taste. Of course, this what I have to base everything off of, because I'm not a huge fan of like silent films or classical slapstick comedy and stuff like that. And that seems like what this is. The gimmick, if you're not aware, is that this episode takes place in an underwater city where there's no one can talk, so there's no sound, there's no dialogue. I mean, there's sound, there's music, but there's no dialogue throughout the whole episode. And I find that it has I really don't like that gimmick. I think it's a stupid gimmick. I think it's very gimmicky, particularly in this episode, which is pretentious. I think this is the dictionary definition of a pretentious episode. Like, ooh, look at how isn't this artsy? And it's so out of character for BoJack. It's so unnecessary. It contributes nothing to the show, and it's really out of character for the show itself. This type of humor is not the type of humor that BoJack typically has. It's an anomaly. It doesn't fit. It's not funny. It's not interesting. It's not original. It's not creative. It is just terrible, and I can't stand to watch it. So, again, that's what's going to piss people off the most. Well, maybe not the most, but it's definitely a strong contender for that. Anyway, we'll move over to my number 12 worst episode, which is Cloverdale from Stargate Universe. Now, Stargate Universe is one of my favorite shows. Now, this is something a lot of people would disagree with, probably more than the episode I chose, because Stargate Universe gets a lot of flack, particularly from Stargate fans, who really attacked this episode when it came out because it was the departure from this typical Stargate tone. But honestly, I prefer it to the other Stargate shows, and I still consider it one of the best shows of all time. But this episode, Cloverdale, was terrible. Now, the funny thing is that most people, even people who don't like the show very much, will tell you that the first season was not as good as the second season, that the second season was way better. There were only 2 seasons, mind you. And I totally disagree. I think the first season was much stronger. And the second season, you get episodes like this. Now, this is an episode where the main character, I can't even remember his name, but it's been a while since I've seen the show. But anyway, he gets in a coma or gets a disease or something, and he's unconscious and fighting for survival. And he has this hallucination that he's in this, small town America town, Cloverdale, and all the main characters of the show are like various characters who populate this town. It's like an excuse to have like a sitcom or like family drama type thing and put the different characters in various different situations, and it's completely unnecessary. It makes no sense for the story of the show. It's just an excuse to give these actors different roles to play and have them play different roles. And plus, I always really hate that hallucination while you're trying to survive gimmick. It reminds me of the TNG episode Shades of Grey. So it's just a really, really terrible episode. So let's get into my number 11, Precious Cargo from Star Trek Enterprise. Now, this is something that I probably won't get too much disagreement about, although I have heard several opinions recently say that this episode doesn't deserve to get all the hate that it gets, and I have to respectfully disagree with this. This episode deserves every bit of hate that gets thrown its way. I mean, this episode is so hated, Star Trek fans voted this one of the 10 worst episodes of the entire franchise, and the showrunner producer of Enterprise, Brennan Braga, at the time that this episode was created, went to the big head producer, Rick Berman, and asked him, can we just not air this episode? Because it was so terrible. I mean, come on. And I totally see why. And I think actually that probably would have been the smarter thing to do. So this is the episode where Trip, again, a character I hate and despise because he's a moron, and he is about him getting trapped with this aristocracy, rich royalty woman who's like a huge bitch to him and very, condescending and privileged, and kept saying, oh, you common man, blah, blah, blah. And then, like, out of nowhere, they start making out, and their romance they had zero chemistry, the romance made no sense. The whole plot of the episode was devoid of any originality, devoid of any creativity, devoid of anything that made anything interesting. And on top of that, the actress who played this, hot matriarch, sucked. She was a terrible actress. So, yes, this is one of the worst episodes and I do include Enterprise as my favorite show, even though the first 2 seasons were terrible, because I love season 3. It's one of my favorite seasons. So, Enterprise is eligible to be considered one of my favorite shows, but this episode sucked. Anyway, let me get into my top 10 now. Let's get into the worst of the worst. We'll start with my number 10, Sub Rosa from Star Trek The Next Generation. Leave her alone! So, this episode is ridiculous. Again, it's another episode that's commonly mocked and made fun of for good reason. It was supposed to be like, it's a cheesy romance novel. But it's worse than a cheesy romance novel. It's a cheesy romance novel done badly. In fact, it is. I have been wanting to watch this episode and just actively make fun of it like a Mystery Science Theater 3000, because it's just so terrible. And Dr. Crusher bangs the Space Ghost. She gets molested by a Space Ghost, but she wants more. And the Space Ghost brings her grandmother back to life when she should have decayed. And they have this overly over the top Scottish cliche, "The dinner to go to the house." It's just an absolutely ridiculous episode. Terrible episode all around. So, we'll now get into my number 9, The Old Ball and Chain from Prison Break. Now, I do love Prison Break, and technically, there's an argument to be made that this isn't technically an episode, because this was the 2-hour film. It's more of an epilogue that came out after the show's final season that sort of wraps up. It fills in the space before God, what's his face? Main character, before he died, and it fills in the space, and it shows his wife going to prison, him having to break her out. And it was terrible. It's one of the worst things I've ever seen. When I look at the canon of Prison Break, I don't include this. In my head, my mind, this is not actually part of the show. This is just some bullshit that doesn't exist. Because it just repeats the same exact thing that the show has already done two or 4 times, but much worse. And then the whole premise of her going to prison made zero sense. Everyone else had immunity, but she didn't, so they put her in prison for I don't remember what it was for, but it was such flimsy logic, and they could have really fought this in court and got her out the legal way, but no, of course they had to prison break her out just because that's what the title of the show, the premise of the show that they already did like 5 fucking times already. It's just and it was so ridiculous, terrible. Anyway, let's get into my number 8, and here's a time where long-term fans of my channel, those familiar with my channel, are going to be shocked that this is only number 8, not number 1, because it usually is number 1 on lists like this, and that is Endgame from Star Trek Voyager. Now, this will also at the same time ruffle some feathers because this episode is also really well loved. I've recently watched this video that said, oh, this is the perfect way to end Voyager. Endgame was an amazing episode. Immediately gave that video a thumbs down, by the way, because that's bullshit. This is terrible. It is, in my opinion, the worst series finale of all time, and I stand by that. Even though it only made number 8 on my list, because I'm looking at it as an episode of television. If I look at it as a finale, as a wrapping up of a show, it's clearly the worst. This is the worst possible way. Just like All Good Things is like a textbook, which is the finale of Next Generation, is a textbook example of the best way, the right way to do a series finale. This is the exact opposite. This is a textbook wrong way to do a series finale. It makes no sense. It's just a bunch of fan service and an incoherent plot that makes zero sense. It's completely inconsistent with the characters. It doesn't pay off any of the character stories or any of the long-term story arcs. That's a 7-year journey about a ship trying to get home, and it makes the ship getting home, nobody gives a shit. It makes you not give a shit. It makes you not care. They finally accomplished this goal. You've been waiting 7 years, and nobody fucking cares. And they just cut to black as soon as they get home. They don't even fucking show what it's like after they get home. And they make the Borg ridiculous cartoon characters, and I can't even... no, it's just terrible. Anyway, we'll get into my number 7 least favorite episode. And that is No Room at the Inn from The Leftovers. Now, I love me The Leftovers. This is from Season 2 of The Leftovers, which I just recently named as one of my top 3 favorite seasons of TV of all time. And I stand by that, because Season 2 of The Leftovers is just a masterpiece. Minus this episode, of course, which is the most pretentious, contrived piece of shit I've ever seen. Like this episode, contrived is the perfect way to describe this episode, because the whole plot is dumb. It's contrived. It's about the priest guy trying to get back into the town of Miracle, but he can't because someone, he lost his arm wristband or whatever. Like, that's the only way they would let him back in, which is bullshit. And he thinks that, his wife needs to get back in because it's a miracle town, that she's she's like paralyzed or whatever, and that I think she was talking or something, and she needs the healing power of the town, so he's desperate, and he does all this ridiculous bullshit. And there's all this pretentious bullshit, like this guy asks him to hit him over the head with the paddle and yell Brian, which is never explained. Of course, it's not explained. There's no explanation, because it's just a bunch of dumb bullshit. This whole episode sucks. Anyway, sorry. Let's get into my number 6 least favorite episode, keeping with the theme of pretentious Damon Lindelof episodes. Let's get into Stranger in a Strange Land from Lost. And yes, I still think this is the worst episode from Lost, even though I hate the final season of Lost. There's some decent things about the finale that kept it off this list, and season 6 in general sucked, but there's no really one episode I can pinpoint to say this is the worst thing ever. Or this episode I can pinpoint and say this is the worst thing ever. It's about Jack's tattoos. It has these stupid flashbacks that make no sense. It's just a bunch of pretentious nonsense about him going to Thailand and getting these weird tattoos where he basically assaults another woman, and we're supposed to think of him as a hero. And then after he assaults her, and her family comes up to him, he's like, "Hey guys, how's it going?" And he's surprised when they kick his ass. Of course they're gonna kick your ass. You just fucking assaulted a woman. But anyway, and then the main episodes, Alien storyline is a bunch of filler bullshit that is never referenced again. It has a character that we never see again. It's a bunch of bullshit that makes no sense. Why they're gonna mark Juliet for no reason when she just did what Ben told her to do. It's a bunch of fucking bullshit. Fuck this episode. Sorry. Getting worked up over this. Okay. Now it's top 5. Now it's time to get into my top 5. So my number 5 worst episode for my favorite shows is Profit and Lace from Star Trek Deep Space Nine. This episode I just recently named the worst episode of the entire Star Trek franchise, and I completely stand by that stance. This episode is Ferengi. Now, Ferengi episodes are always suck at Deep Space Nine, with one or two exceptions. They're always just ridiculous comedy bullshit, and this is the absolute worst example. Its biggest crime is this is not funny. It's actively not funny. There's nothing that even made me crack the slightest bit of a smile, and it's annoying as fuck. And it's very degrading to the transgender community, very degrading to the gay community, it's very degrading to women. It has, this guy actively trying to rape Quark that is played off for laugh, and Quark, actively sexually harasses a woman who, says, ooh, she's turned on by it. It's offensive. It's an offensive, more offensive than Code of Honor, which hadn't made this list, obviously, because I had Seb Urso on there. It's an offensive, unfunny, poorly scripted, just cliche after cliche piece of shit. Anyway, we'll get into my number 4 worst episode from my favorite shows, and that is the National Anthem from Black Mirror. This is the first episode of Black Mirror. I wonder why I kept watching this show after I saw this episode, because this episode I thought, oh my god, this episode's terrible. This is the pig fucking episode. Basically, the one when some guy kidnaps a royal who's she's the 3rd generation royal, whatever, and holds her captive, and he demands that the Prime Minister of the UK fuck a pig, otherwise he's gonna harm or kill the royal. Okay, that's a dumb premise to begin with, but I find mainly one of the main reasons why I hate this episode so much is that its social commentary is off. It's way, way off. Everyone turns on the Prime Minister and thinks he's an asshole. Oh, how dare he not fuck a pig? And when he does fuck a pig, they're like, oh my god, what an asshole for fucking the pig. I mean, I suppose it's supposed to be commentary on how, the public and the media portray, but I think the commentary is very off. And secondly, there's no way in fuck that any politician, especially someone who is a leader of their country, would actually fuck a pig. They would be like, well, screw the world. They would just find some way to spin it and be like, well, we tried everything we can, but this is blah, 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 blah. And they would just spin their bullshit. There's no way in hell would they ever fuck the pig. And it was just and the actual pig fucking thing was just such a stupid thing. I was just like, oh my god. Now, granted, in this episode, they tried some ways to fake it, but it didn't work because the guy figured it out, which I didn't buy. They played him off like he's some super genius, like he could smell through any deceit, yet he just ended up being some random dude who didn't give a shit. No, he wouldn't be able to tell us. They definitely would have been able to pull one. There's too many plot holes in this. It's a stupid premise. The social commentary is off. It's just dumb. Anyway, now I'm going to get into my top 3. So these 3 are very neck and neck for me. All 3 of these episodes, I think, are the worst of the worst of the worst. They actively bother me. So, let's start with my number 3. And again, this is another episode. When I name it, half the people watching this are going to totally agree with me, and the other half are going to fucking hate me and think this episode's a masterpiece. I guess that's what you get when you get Rian Johnson as director. Anyway, my number 3 is The Fly from Breaking Bad. Now, I had named this as the worst episode of Breaking Bad. I just recently went back and watched my video where I did, and I got so many comments with people telling me you're wrong about this episode. It's a masterpiece. It's great. But I was actually being very lenient. I wasn't hard enough on this episode in that video. Like, I could have destroyed this episode a lot more. So I'm not wrong. If you think this episode is a masterpiece, you are wrong. I'm sorry, there's no other way to say this. Now, I did watch his essay saying why this terrible episode is actually brilliant and genius, and their whole premise was because, alright, so what they were saying why people hate this episode, don't like it, is because they're not giving it a fair shot. Because they think that it's just filler, a waste of time, and that it's boring. And they said, well, actually, if you look beyond the superficial, you can see that it's actually a brilliantly well-scripted character story. Well, here's the thing. This episode is filler. It is ridiculous. It is unnecessary. It is boring. But that's not the worst offense of this episode. That's not what makes this episode so terrible in my eyes. What makes this episode totally one of the worst episodes I've ever seen is that it's a bad character story. Let me repeat that. It is a bad character story. That's why people say, oh, it's a good character story, are flat out wrong. It is, in fact, a terrible character story. Because Walter White and Jesse, especially Walter White, act completely out of character. Completely 1000% out of character. It is inconsistent with the rest of the show. This is not how he would behave. Granted, he's been shown as a bit neurotic. He's definitely been shown as egotistical. But the fact where he would go so fucking crazy about a single fly being trapped in a lab just does not add up. It is out of character. Completely 1000% out of character for him. Now, granted, there are some nice pieces of dialogue or interactions between Jesse and Walt in this episode, but here's the thing. There's like just a couple minutes of goodness. But here's the thing. You could have had those nice character interactions in any episode. You could have put them in any other episode. Just sprinkle them in, it would have worked fine. You don't need to create an entire episode with a stupid premise about them trying to catch a stupid fly in the lab where he acts completely out of character, and the entire episode is dragged out. It is spread out for way too long. It is boring, it's uninteresting, and it's totally unnecessary. Completely 1000% unnecessary. Anyone who watches Breaking Bad, I will tell them, skip the episode The Fly. You will miss nothing. You will miss nothing. You will still get the great Breaking Bad experience. You'll get all the best thing of the show. You will miss absolutely nothing by skipping this episode. It's a complete waste of time. More than that, it is badly written. It is a bad character story. A bad character story. In fact, one of these days, I should make an essay video saying why those people who made the essay video saying how it's brilliant, how they're actually wrong. They are wrong, wrong, wrong. It is a terrible, terribly written episode. Anyway, sorry. I can just imagine the angry comments right now. So, bad character. Bad. Anyway, let me get into my number 2 least favorite episode, and that is Brave Traveler from Mr. Robot. Now, in my Mr. Robot reviews, I have recounted the tale about how I nearly quit watching this show. I believe this was the 6th episode of season 1, so the show hadn't been going for that long, so it hadn't completely won me over at this stage. And after watching this episode, I actively was pissed off. Now, this happened a few times, like No Country for Old Men is an example, and there's a couple of like throwaway made for cable or made for Netflix movies that also kind of really pissed me off after I watched it. But I don't think I was ever as pissed off after watching something as I was of watching this episode. It's not, see, the thing about episodes and movies that piss me off is not that they're bad per se. It's that, in fact, they could have been good if they just went a different direction. But they went a direction that was so contrived and so pretentious and just so obvious the attempt of being, ooh, look at how edgy we are, where it ruins it. And for me, that's actually more frustrating than watching something that's just flat out terrible like Sub Rosa or Precious Cargo. It's more frustrating when you have a good premise, you have good characters, you have good acting, and you have an interesting premise that's suspenseful, and then you totally fuck it up. That is, to me, that just pisses me off. That's way worse. Now, this episode featured the character Fernando Vera, who is a character I cannot stand. When he was first introduced in, like, I think the second or third episode of Mr. Robot, I was like, oh my god, I hope this character goes away. I can't fucking stand him. And when he went away, I was like, oh, thank god. But then they bring him back, and of course they bring him back later in season 4, which, you know, I'm not even going to get into that. But when they bring him back for this episode, I'm like, no, god, no. We're done with this character. Please don't bring him back. He's terrible. And then they have this. Okay, so they have a character of Sheila, who's Elliot's girlfriend, who I thought was a really interesting character. I thought that she brought an interesting dynamic to Elliot. Now, it's clear that the writers that she didn't fit into what the writers wanted to do for the rest of the show, that they wanted to take Elliot in a different direction, which Sheila didn't fit in. So they wanted to write her off the show. That's very clear. Which is fine. You want to write her off the show, have her break up with him, have her leave town. There's many other ways to even have her die. You could do that. But the way that they had her killed in this episode was just such contrived, pretentious bullshit. Because Elliot, she was held hostage, and Elliot had to do everything to set Vera free, and he did everything, and yet they killed her anyway. And he's like, haha, bro, blah, blah. I guess the moral of the episode was supposed to be that there was a no-win scenario, but it was such a it was constructed in such a terrible contrived way, which I didn't buy it. It was bullshit. It was so obvious. It was just some writers doing some stupid bullshit. It didn't actually make sense. I wanted to fucking punch them in the face after watching this episode. It was just so terrible. Alright. Now, what could be worse than that? Well, let me get into my number one worst episode from my favorite shows. And those who are really familiar with my channel probably can see this one coming. My number one worst episode from any show, or from my favorite show, from any great show in my opinion, is the bells from Game of Thrones. So this is the penultimate episode of the entire show of Game of Thrones. Now, anyone who's seen my review of Game of Thrones know how much I despise the ending of Game of Thrones. Now, this is a hotly debated topic, even though I will say the vast majority of people also agree that the ending of Game of Thrones was terrible. That's a fact of life. If you disagree, you're factually wrong. But anyway, vast majority of people agree that the ending of Game of Thrones was terrible. And this penultimate episode was the crowning achievement of bad writing. Now, let me get the straw mans out of the way. All the straw mans will say, hey, people just didn't like this episode because they were unhappy that Daenerys turned out to be a villain. They wanted her to be a hero. Bullshit. That's wrong. False. Straw man. Not true. I would be perfectly fine if she was the villain, if it was built up to properly, if it made sense for her character, and if it was done in an interesting, believable manner. This 1000% was not. All other straw men, oh, you're just unhappy because your theories didn't come true. Again, 1000% false bullshit. There's a lot of times in Game of Thrones where my theories didn't come true that I loved because it was great writing and it did something even better than what I theorized. And some of my theories did come true in this ending, and I still wasn't happy, and I still thought it sucked because the way it was done was not done well. And the other thing a lot of people throw out, this is the pinnacle. This was done for Lost and other shows that failed to end properly. They throw out this bullshit statement of, well, you can't please anyone. This is a hard show to write for, so there was no ending that would please the whole audience, which is a cop-out. I mean, it's technically true, but it's virtually meaningless, because even though, yes, it's technically true that not 100% of the audience is going to be happy with any ending. There are certain endings that will please the majority of audiences, where the majority audience will be happy with. And there are other endings, such as this one and Lost, where the majority of the audience will be unhappy with. The majority of the audience will hate and will feel cheated and will feel like they ruined a great show. And this is definitely that example. For that, every single character conclusion they had in this episode was out of character, did not make sense. I think the person who put this best is Ryan George, who does his pitch meetings over on Screen Rant. And if you haven't seen the pitch meeting for Game of Thrones Season 8, do yourself a favor and watch it. It's hilarious because he nails it. Nails it exactly. So it's about like he's pretending that the writer of this Season 8 of Game of Thrones is pitching the concept of Season 8 to a producer. And the producer says to him, wow, this sounds like an interesting concept that could be done properly over the course of 3 seasons. I can give you those 3 seasons to do it. He's like, yeah, no, but I don't want to. Like, which is what it boils down to. Is that the Game of Thrones is a great show up to season 6, and a lot of people will say season 4. I think they're wrong. I think up to season 6 was great. Season 5 and 6, yeah, had some issues, but they were still great seasons. Season 7 is when it all started to go downhill, because season 7 and 8 were telling the story of the final 2 novels, which have yet to be written. And it did so in 13 episodes. George R. R. Martin himself said that he thought the show should have went for 10 seasons. It's very clear from this outline that they had that happened in these 13 episodes that it needed to happen the bare minimum of 30 episodes in order to make sense. This is the dictionary definition of rushed writing, of writers who did not care, who were just lazy and tired of writing the show and just wanted it over and done with. I mean, there's a scene, not even the Daenerys stuff, which is bad enough on its own, but everything about this episode is terrible. There's a scene where they have Euron and Jaime Lannister fighting, and it made no sense. It was so unearned that when I saw this episode, I laughed hysterically about how bad it is. I mean, what a bad sign for a show which I once considered the greatest show ever created, before season 7 and 8, obviously, that was so great in its first 6 seasons. Such a masterpiece of dialogue, well written, acting, everything you could think of. It was just a masterpiece. And to go from that to basically being like The Room, you know, the Tommy Wiseau, I did not hit her, where it's so terrible you want to laugh at it. That's what it became. That Jaime and fucking Euron fight scene was so terrible. And it's inconsistent within its own 2 episodes. Like the previous episode that had the scorpion, arrow things shooting that killed the dragons, and it was like unstoppable. Like they killed one dragon, the other dragon had to fly away because they were just unstoppably killing them. And in this episode, there were even more of those things, yet they were totally useless, and the dragon just completely destroyed them all easily without breaking a sweat. I mean, what the actual fuck? And they had this golden company that they were building up as badasses, and all they do is just die instantly. And whereas fucking Jaime Lannister, they completely undid and ruined like 4 seasons of character development in 1 episode. The whole thing with Arya was completely out of character, how she just turned around. Oh yeah, you're right, hon, I'll just turn around so you can have your Clegane Bowl fan service bullshit. Like this whole episode, everything about this episode, not to mention that it was the worst and was out of character bullshit for Daenerys that made no sense. There are essays, really long, in-depth essays written about how terrible this episode was written and the whole ending of Game of Thrones. And those essays are completely 100% spot on. I'll tell you what. There's some like screenwriters like Ronald D. Moore, and I think there were some other famous ones who defended the ending of I think Damon Lindelof as well defended the ending of Game of Thrones and sympathized with them. When they do that, I lose all respect for them. I'm sorry. I lose all respect. And Seth Rogen, in a Comic-Con interview, I think for a panel he did for Preacher, I want to say, he outright, when asked about Game of Thrones, he outright said this ending sucks, and he was mocking it and saying it was terrible writing and pointing out a lot of things I just point out. So that made my opinion of Seth Rogen went up way higher. Like, I now have so much respect for Seth Rogen for not placating and being, but there was no one's gonna be happy, blah blah blah, and saying all the bullshit. He right out and pointed, so as he says, that any objective, unbiased opinion who looks at this from a story writing perspective can see very clearly that this is a disaster in the absolute worst possible way you could write an ending for a show. It is by far the worst episode from any of my favorite shows. So that's it for my top 15 least favorite episodes from my favorite shows. Sorry if I upset or ruffled any feathers. As I said, this is just my opinion. Wanted to get it out there. Some, of course, I feel very passionate about. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, if it didn't upset you too much, check out the rest of my channel for many more reviews I do on shows like Discovery, The Expanse, many Star Trek shows, BoJack Horseman, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.